Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we will do something a little bit different from the usual topics. This time I will be telling you a little bit more about the early stages of the development of maritime archaeology, and more specifically the technological aspects of maritime archaeology. For example, today we will be talking about the first scientific, privately commissioned submarine. It remains the only private, non-military submarine ever built by Electric Boat Company in Groton. It was commissioned by the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. More specifically, it was commissioned by Professor George Bass, the founder of nautical archaeology. It was commissioned with the idea that it would be used for surveying and for finding more shipwrecks in the Mediterranean world. It was pretty much at the height of the development, the early stages of development of nautical archaeology. The institute, or rather the people who would eventually form the institute, had completed the Asherah 7th century shipwreck, which really is a benchmark for maritime archaeology, a project that developed all the techniques that we are still using to the present day. So this little submarine was supposed to be a two-person submarine. He had very high expectations of it, that it will aid dramatically in the search for shipwrecks. By this stage, of course, both sonars and magnetometers did exist and were used, but the bottom relief around the coasts of Turkey consists of rocks and ridges and drops between ridges, which is the sort of ideal condition to befuddle a sonar and to make it harder to discover wrecks. In fact, the late Professor Bass always said that practically all the shipwrecks that the Institute for Nautical Archaeology excavated were found by sponge fishermen mostly in that area. Therefore, the argument went, a submarine is the ideal tool to look for these shipwrecks. At the same time, the shipwreck would allow also the project director, the senior-most archaeologist, to observe what is happening on the bottom and to monitor the work undertaken by the others. Considering the depth of most of the shipwrecks in the Mediterranean along the Turkish coast, it is understandable that in reality the project director gets about half an hour to 40 minutes per day on the archaeological site. So what do you do in these 40 minutes? What do you do first? Do you excavate? Do you work in your own square? Or do you go to see how the others are doing, what is happening in the other squares, and develop a better understanding of the overall site? So the submarine was supposed to take care of all of these challenges. It was named Asherah after a Phoenician sea goddess. Initially it was painted orangish, red-orangish color, and for a while was used extensively. There were a few details that were a bit of a challenge for the archaeologists. First of all, the engineers and the archaeologists had completely different understanding of what the submarine should be like. The archaeologists, of course, wanted the maximum possible visibility, as wide portholes as is possible. The engineers considered this to be a weakness in the design, so they did their best to make them as small and as few as possible. And at the end of the day, the engineers pretty much got what they wanted. The archaeologists, not so much, shall we say. The submarine fulfilled most of its duties, but it may have proven to be a bit of a challenge in the search process, especially since it required a fairly large support vessel with her, and even more specifically and more importantly, eventually the insurance rates, the maintenance of the submarine proved to be way too heavy of a burden to the archaeologists. So yes, in the beginning Asherah was used for surveying, but what Asherah proved to be particularly good at was, of course, what submarines do best, namely maintain specific depth It was easier for a submarine to do it than for a diver. And thus, the archaeologists came to the discovery that she is ideally designed to use in the early forms of photogrammetry. Thus, to the front end of the boat was welded a framework, a calibrated framework, on which cameras could be adjusted. And these cameras would be shooting a series of pictures down towards the archaeological site, knowing the specific depth at which the submarine is operating. Parallax and all these corrections could be introduced, and therefore produce a photomosaic of the site that would be useful in drawing the final archaeological site plan. For that, Asherah was absolutely perfect. She was used for this purpose during the excavations of the 4th century Roman wreck of the Asada and a number of other projects. Asherah proved the concept of submarine used in maritime archaeology, but unfortunately, it proved to be rather expensive to maintain. The insurance rates, then the certification of the submarine. This meant that it had to be shipped back to the United States, and that, of course, dramatically increased the cost of operation. And eventually, it was come to the conclusion that the cost-benefit analysis is against keeping Asherah. So Asherah was sold to a company that used it as a tour boat. A little bit more successful tour boat, shall we say, than the one that attempted to go to Titanic this summer, since as far as I know, she never drowned anyone. And then Asherah mostly disappeared. We no longer knew what had happened with it. Interestingly enough, this past summer, the president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and myself, while traveling together, were discussing exactly this, the fate of the Asherah. At some point it had been offered to Texas A&M, but the university decided that it is a liability because all horror students might try to climb on her and get hurt, so they refused to pick her up. Our conclusion was that most likely the submarine had been broken up after that. Fast forward to the final days of August, beginning of September, when at a meeting at the university, the part of the leadership of Mystic Seaport Museum, specifically Dr. Brophy, spoke about a new acquisition at the museum, a small yellow submarine, and for a while had a bit of a struggle with the name, but it was perfectly obvious that the name was Asherah. So of course I started asking questions. They were kind enough to show me a photograph, and lo and behold, after so many years, Asherah resurfaced. And resurfaced at the perfect place for the submarine, in my humble opinion. Asherah is now part of the permanent collection of Mystic Seaport Museum and is on display there. I cannot thank enough the leadership of the museum for their kindness in giving me access to the submarine, allowing me to even get inside. It was an extremely moving moment for me. Despite the fact that this submarine had disappeared from the Institute and from maritime archaeology long before I entered the field. But so many years I have been teaching about the use of Asherah. I have shown photographs in class, projects on which Asherah worked and the situations in which she worked. And of course, Dr. Bass wrote about her in his manual on maritime, or rather nautical archaeology, which he wrote back in the mid-60s, mid to late 60s. I believe it was 1966-67 that the book was published. And so, lo and behold, there she was, well preserved. The only difference from the old Asherah is the framework for the cameras has changed. Instead of the large old camera, there is another grid in front of the submarine. The color of the submarine had changed from orangish reddish. It is now yellow. No doubt whoever repainted her did have the Beatles song in mind. But it still is the same old Asherah. And what more perfect place than Mystic Seaport, which after all is the connection American museum that is marketed as American the Sea. This submarine has a number of firsts. It is the first privately commissioned research submarine, I'm sorry. It is the first and so far only civilian vessel constructed by EB, the shipyard that builds nuclear submarines. It is quite a few years old now. It had been used extensively. What could be a more perfect home for her? So once again, thank you very, very much to Mystic Seaport Museum, to specifically Dr. Brophy and Dr. Turner. And it was one of the most pleasant experiences that I have had in a long time, seeing the submarine and knowing that she has ended up in a good place where they will look after her. And this piece of the history of nautical archaeology is preserved for the generations to come. Thank you ever so much, and I hope to see you soon on the channel again. Thank you.